Have you ever noticed how suffering can repeat itself even when the day looks ordinary, almost neutral, as if time itself is looping around the same invisible point? Imagine waking up, making coffee, checking your phone, and feeling a quiet tension you can't explain. Not anxiety exactly, not sadness, just a subtle pressure beneath everything. Nothing bad has happened. No memory was triggered. Yet the feeling is already there, familiar in a way that's unsettling. It's the same feeling you've had on other mornings, in other places, with different people, different circumstances, same internal atmosphere. That's when a strange thought slips in, usually unnoticed. What if this isn't coming from the world at all? What if the hidden reality you're moving through isn't shaped by events, but by something much closer, something tied to quantum consciousness itself, the way perception quietly organizes experience before you're aware of it? Most people brush this off and move on, assuming it's just mood or stress. But some moments linger longer than they should, like a glitch you can't unsee once you notice it. And if you've ever sensed that leaving right now would mean missing the one detail that explains why this pattern keeps returning, you already know why it's hard to look away. And in moments like this, there's often a quiet recognition that happens before any understanding does. Not agreement, not belief, just a subtle sense of being seen by something you hadn't named yet. That's usually when people pause the video for a second, not to decide anything, but to acknowledge internally that this isn't random. If that recognition is happening now, letting it register matters more than reacting to it. And if you feel compelled to leave a trace of that moment, write a single line beginning with, "I noticed that." Not for explanation, just continuation. Because what comes next isn't opinion or philosophy. It's where this silent pattern begins to show up in measurable ways, inside the mechanisms that quietly govern perception itself. What follows isn't theory or metaphor. In 1978, physicist John Archibald Wheeler, working within the context of Princeton University, proposed what later became known as the delayed choice experiment, a refinement of the double-slit experiment that had already unsettled physics for decades. The unsettling part wasn't that particles behaved like waves, or that observation mattered. It was when it mattered. In Wheeler's setup, the decision to observe a particle's behavior could be made after the particle had already entered the system. And yet, the outcome still aligned with the choice of observation, as if the particle's past behavior reorganized itself to remain consistent with what was eventually measured. No signal traveled backward in time. No force intervened. The system simply behaved as if reality was not finalized until it was perceived. Intuitively, this suggests something uncomfortable, that the observer effect is not an interruption of reality, but a completion of it. The quantum field does not present a fixed story waiting to be discovered. It offers possibilities that collapse into experience only when perception takes shape. And this means that you are not just moving through reality. You are participating in how it stabilizes moment to moment, not consciously, not deliberately, but through the predictive structures your mind continuously generates. When those structures are saturated with familiar emotional states, the system favors them, selecting experiences that feel consistent rather than ones that feel free. This is where consciousness expansion stops sounding abstract and starts feeling personal, because the same mechanism that collapses probabilities in physics also governs how psychological patterns repeat without external cause. But this raises a deeper fracture. If perception completes reality at the quantum level, what happens when the observing system itself is trapped in a loop? That question opens a door most people never step through, and once you see where it leads, it becomes impossible to unsee. And this explains why perception doesn't just happen in the brain, but through coordinated patterns across it. In the mid-1990s, neuroscientist Francisco Varela, working at the CNRS in Paris, studied something called neural coherence, the way distant regions of the brain synchronize their electrical rhythms in order to produce a single, unified experience. His research showed that perception is not localized to one area, but emerges when multiple neural networks temporarily lock into the same rhythm. When coherence forms, experience feels stable. When it breaks, reality feels fragmented, uncertain, or strangely quiet. This isn't mystical, it's measurable. Electroencephalography can detect when coherence rises and falls, even in the absence of external stimulation. What's unsettling is how quickly the body notices these shifts. You might recognize the sudden stillness that appears right before an insight, or that brief internal silence when everything seems to line up without effort. Sometimes it shows up as a physical easing in the chest, or a moment of clarity that doesn't arrive through thinking. These sensations aren't messages from outside reality. They're signals that internal coherence has changed, that predictive noise has dropped, if only for a moment. But coherence doesn't form randomly. The brain favors patterns it has already synchronized before. Emotional states, expectations, and familiar internal narratives all shape which neural assemblies resonate together. Once a configuration becomes dominant, the system returns to it automatically, because coherence feels safe. This is how a resonance loop forms. Perception stabilizes around what the system already knows how to maintain, and understanding this carries a cost. Because once you recognize that stability and suffering can share the same mechanism, you can no longer pretend that awareness itself is neutral. This is where the conversation usually gets quiet, because recognizing these patterns doesn't feel empowering in the way people expect. It often feels like standing slightly outside the room while everyone else continues as if nothing has changed. There's a subtle loneliness that comes with noticing how perception shapes experience, because it becomes harder to fully blame circumstances or fully trust explanations that once felt sufficient. You might feel displaced inside familiar routines, unsure why conversations sound rehearsed, why reactions feel predictable, why belonging seems conditional. Doubt creeps in, not just about the world, but about your own interpretations. You start wondering whether you're overanalyzing, or whether you've simply seen something that can't be unseen. This isn't clarity in the comforting sense. It's a quiet weight, a sense that awareness has narrowed certain paths while opening others you don't yet know how to walk. And yet, this discomfort points towards something essential, because beneath the isolation and uncertainty is a realization forming, one that reframes the entire loop you've been observing. And once that realization comes into focus, it changes how you understand what this system has been asking of you all along. What begins to take shape here is a quieter reframe. That feeling of being out of sync, of sensing patterns others seem to move past without noticing, isn't a flaw in the system. It's a shift in how perception is organized. Earlier, you saw how reality doesn't arrive fully formed, how the observer effect and neural coherence show that experience stabilizes only when perception aligns with familiar internal structures. Then you felt the cost of recognizing those structures from the inside. The distance, the doubt, the subtle isolation that follows awareness.
Put together, something becomes clear without needing to be stated outright. Being different often means perceiving with fewer filters, not malfunctioning within them. But this realization carries an unsettling implication. If consciousness participates in shaping what feels real, and if perception tends to repeat what it already knows, then awareness itself becomes a threshold, not a solution, not an escape, just a boundary where reality could reorganize, but hasn't yet.
Some theories of consciousness suggest it isn't generated by the brain alone, but constrained by it, like a signal narrowed through a receiver. If that's even partially true, then moments of dissonance aren't errors. They're points where the constraint loosens slightly, just enough for the system to feel unstable. This is where the story remains intentionally unfinished. Because if perception can expand without immediately stabilizing, then what you've been sensing isn't an ending, it's a transition. And transitions are rarely comfortable or clear. They don't announce what comes next. They only make it harder to return to seeing the world the same way again. If this felt less like reaching a conclusion and more like arriving at a quiet stopping point, that's intentional. Some realizations don't close stories. They change how the story is perceived from that moment on. Staying connected after an experience like this isn't about following a channel. It's about allowing a line of awareness to continue unfolding, instead of snapping back into familiarity. What comes next doesn't resolve the tension you've been sitting with. It applies pressure to it. The next video continues this exploration under the title, Why a Single Thought is Enough to Change Your Reality. Not as an answer, but as a disturbance to what you currently assume is stable. Your consciousness brought you here. What happens now is your choice.